mode. Here we go. Just a little clarification. I saw in the program that I'm listed in Brussels, but we are actually based in Seville, in Spain. So I say this because then it comes up in the presentation. So, and of course, what I'm going to say tonight are basically my views and do not necessarily reflect those of the European Commission. Now, as you have already said, and as we all know, basically, the green transition now is going to have, it's already having profound restructuring of the economic system. It's going to affect industries, occupations, and of course, skill requirements. Of course, this has raised concerns about the potential shortage of skilled workers, which are needed to support the green transition. Now, obviously, in this debate, in this context, a relevant question arises, which is what kind of workers are needed for the green transition to new industries that are emerging, and how do we properly fit the new jobs that are going to emerge in this process. Of course, there is also another discussion, which is what we're going to do with those jobs that we are losing. And we are not touching this discussion here, but it's good that we have this in mind as well. Now, my argument mainly is made of 2 points here. The first one is a little bit of a critique of the dominant method that it's around there to estimate green jobs or green employment in Europe, because myself and my colleagues at the JRC have argued that there are important theoretical and methodological limitations. Now, this aspect might be a bit boring, you know, because there are a little bit of technicalities and so on, but I think it's super important because from a weak methodology to estimate what green employment is, obviously derive weak policies advice. So I think it's worth stopping a little bit and have some reflection on these points. And my second point, which I admit is going to be a bit provocative on purpose and more provocative than I actually think, but I think it's good to stimulate the debate. It is the following, and it is that the green transition perhaps has fewer problematic implications for the labor market than it is usually believed. And I link this point with my previous one about the way we estimate green employment. Therefore, now what I'm going to do is a brief introduction of the concepts of what green jobs or green employment are, and then I'm going to focus on the bulk of my presentation, which is the critique to the task-based or occupational approach to green jobs. I'm going to also discuss some possible alternatives, and of course, the policy implications, which probably are the most interesting part and most relevant part of the discussion. Okay, so first of all, what do we mean by green jobs? Here I put green job or green employment. Here I put a sort of general definition, which refers to green employment as the workers that contribute to green production, either via the production of goods and services that benefit the environment or through the greening of the production process. Now, I know that you as an association and alliance are mostly focused on the energy sector, rightly so. Of course, however, the green transition involves also other sectors, such as constructions, transportation, and etc. Okay, so it's kind of a broader perspective what we have here. And what we would like to do is to estimate green employment in the whole of the economy, not just in the energy sector, okay? I'm going to talk a lot about construction because I think it's a very interesting example of kind of a key sector for the green transition. Now, from this general definition, you can see that there are already two differentiations that we can do, which are basically the output approach and the process approach in the definition of green employment. These are these are widely accepted definitions in the literature. By the output approach, basically, we look at the employment which is involved in the production of a green final output, where a green final output is basically a good or a service that benefits the environment. Okay, kind of very broadly defined. And then we have the process approach, which looks at the pollution level of the production process. That is, how green or how greening is the production process itself. This means also can mean some paradox, such as, for example, that a production process of a good that benefits the environment can be very polluted or can be polluting itself. For example, the construction sector, which can be very beneficial for the environment if you build net zero emission buildings, demands a lot of cement, for example, which in itself is a relatively high contaminant industry. At the same time, from the process approach, we might have a non-green production process, a non-green output, such as, for example, oil. This is kind of an extreme example, but you can think of any industry, which go through a process of greening the production itself, such as, for example, by changing conventional vehicles to e-vehicles, and therefore having a production process that contaminates less. Now, in what we are going to do today, I think it's more useful to consider only the output approach. Because I think it's also the one that best targets and best fits what the green transition is about. But I think it's good, for the sake of clarity, to have clear that we have at least two different approaches from which we can look at green employment. Okay. Now, the main contribution, I mean, most of the talk that I'm gonna give today comes from, as I was saying, a research project that I did with my colleagues at the Joint Research Center in Seville, which comes from a request that we received from Brussels a few years ago that was about the quantification of green jobs in Europe. Obviously, with the deployment of the Green Deal, etc., they were interested in knowing how many green jobs, green workers we have in Europe and how this have evolved. Of course, to quantify these workers, what we need is a methodology to do so. A methodology to basically quantify that we have here, the employment that contributes to green production. Okay, so this is the main objective that we had. And therefore, what we did was basically, also because we were kind of invited to do so, because the Commission had already done some background work using this approach, basically to use this task-based occupational approach to green jobs. To be honest, we were not very expert in green topics. We come from an employment background, and it was, for some of us, the first time that we approached these issues. So we said, of course, let's go and study what this is about. However, there we saw that, in our view, there were some criticalities that are central to this approach, and so we deepened the analysis there. We decided to focus on this one because it's by far the dominant one, and also because other alternative approach use, to some extent, some of the features and criticalities of this same task occupational approach. Recently, we have published also the main findings in a paper that has been published in Ecological Economics, which reflects part of what I'm saying today. Okay, so first of all, what we have to understand a little bit is how does this approach, which is the dominant, operates? How do we quantify green workers? Now, first of all, what we need to start from is the concept of tasks. Probably some of you already know, but task has become a central topic a central concept in economics, especially in labor economics. Tasks simply refer to all the pieces of activities that a certain worker does in her or his job daily. So for example, I am a researcher. The tasks of a researcher are basically those of reading studies, writing reports, doing data analysis, go to meetings, etc., etc. Okay, so these are what tasks are basically in general. From this perspective, occupations are considered a bundle of tasks. Any occupation is made of X and whatever number of tasks, okay? And this is a general approach. It doesn't have to do with green or anything. It's just something general that economists use. So some people say, okay, if we are able to track those tasks that are green, then we are able to track green occupations, and then what we can do is to quantify the green employment in a certain economy. This is the linearity of the mechanism there. However, there we already start having caveats. The first one, important one, is that especially at the time, there were no worldwide database. There were no databases worldwide that included information about occupations and tasks with a very detailed level that is necessary for the analysis. One of the solutions was to use the ONET database, which is the key reference in task databases, which is an US-based database. Okay, this is used pretty much in all the literature. It's widely accepted. And specifically with regards to the classification of green versus non-green task, what we had in 2009 was the same ONET that made a green project and listed each of the tasks attached to each of the occupation between green and non-green tasks. So here you can see pretty much how this looks like. So for example, we have something similar for any occupations. We have like more than 1,000 occupations. This is for power plant operators. We have a number of tasks. We have many more. I just took some of them, but we have a number of tasks, and then a group of experts decided if any of these tasks could be classified as green or non-green. Now, already here, there is some sort of discretionality because some people said, okay, this task is green, this task is not green. And obviously, as you can imagine, it's not always easy to differentiate between them. But let's leave this issue aside for a moment. This was what had been done. Therefore, from this list, we have something similar for all of the 1,000 occupations, and of course, thousands of tasks. What they did basically was to have a list of occupations containing green tasks, and therefore any occupation that contained a green task could be considered a green occupation. Okay, so that was pretty much straightforward. Now, having a list of green occupations, analysts around the world, what they would simply do was to go to the National Institutes of Statistics, or European, as in our case, take data on occupations, count all the workers in those green occupations, and end up with a number of green workers. Okay, so we have the total number of green workers in the economy, which are those that are in green occupations. Okay, so this is pretty much how this methodology works. Now, before we move on, I would like to make a couple of points. The first one is that this is supposed to be a task-based analysis, as we said at the beginning. However, we don't see tasks. What we actually are able to observe are the occupational titles of the workers, because as we are saying, we rely on a classification that was done in the United States in 2009, but we don't really see the tasks. We just assume that that classification is valid here and today. And this leads to the second point, that is the time and place invariance. That is, that we have to assume that the task profile of an occupation remains constant over time and is uniform across all locations, basically everywhere. And we're going to see in a second why this might be problematic. Now, our main critique is kind of theoretical and is the following. If we divide the, so before we enter here, so what I want to make clear is this point. We only have occupations, and what we are only able to do is to quantify the number of workers that are in so-called green occupations, okay? Now, obviously the economy can be divided into two groups of output. For our objectives, we have green outputs and non-green outputs. Ideally, what the methodology should be able to do is to identify all the green occupations that contribute to the production of a green output, okay? So this is what we would like to have. For example, robotic engineers. Robotic engineers is a green occupation, according to the list that I've just mentioned. And we would like to get all the robotic engineers that contribute to green outputs. However, as I've just said, we only are able to trace all robotic engineers in Austria or in Germany or in Europe. We don't know if this robotic engineer contributes to green output or it contributes to non-green outputs. Therefore, here we have a first major issue with this approach. That is that when we quantify green occupations, we are including workers that do not contribute to the production of green output, and therefore we are facing false positives. At the same time, what we argue is that among those non-green occupations that are therefore excluded from the classification that I mentioned before, there might be some workers that are considered non-green, but are still critical for the production of green outputs. For example, you might have accountants. A solar panel factory needs accountant to work. Manual workers also might be critical to the production of green output. In other words, there might be all a set of occupations that are of workers that are left outside the consideration of green occupations just because they don't have in that 2009 classification a task that it was considered green. Therefore, what we think is that this classification excludes workers that do contribute to the production of green output, but are excluded because of these reasons. Therefore, we have false negatives. This leads to our main point, that is, the occupational title in itself is not indicative to the contribution that that worker can do to the environment. Of course, there are cases in which it is more clear. A solar panel engineer, 99% of the cases, will have a positive impact on the environment because he will design solar panels that benefit the environment. Now, a researcher like me can have a positive impact on the environment if I do research on how to be more sustainable, or I could be very harmful to the environment if I study how to kill more efficiently whales or whatever, you know. Therefore, my occupational title, which is researcher, doesn't really tell anything about my actual contribution to the environment. And this can apply to many, many other occupations. This leads to the two previous point that I had already mentioned, that is about the time and place invariance. As we were saying, this green occupational task approach rests on mainly two assumptions. The first one is that the content of occupation the task content, of occupations does not change in time. And the second one is that within the same occupations, tasks are similar across countries. Now, why these 2 points are problematic? The first one has to do to the fact that technology and regulation, especially in the context of the green of the green transition evolves constantly. So, for example, take the European Energy Performance and Building Directive, which probably you know. This directive basically establishes that by 2050, I think, all the construction sector must be net zero emission. It also establishes that any new building that is built in Europe has a net zero impact on the environment. Now, this obviously is a huge change, is a huge regulatory change that might need also new technologies. Now, what does it change for a construction worker? Probably not much. The same worker that until a couple of years ago was building a conventional building that was not considered green would do pretty much the same thing today, in which he builds he contributes to build a building which is with net zero emission. Okay, so this is, for example, a case in which we cannot differentiate, we cannot capture these differences, because again, what we only do is to take the classification based on occupations. If that occupation was green, then we continue to treat that green. Otherwise, we don't. The second point has to do with the problem that the same occupational title, the same profession can do very different things in different countries. So, for example, here I put the case of a power plant operator. A power plant operators are considered green occupations. However, in Sweden, where there are 70% of renewable, it's very unlikely that a power plant operator has the same green content as a power plant operator in Belgium, where only 15% of the energy comes from renewables. Okay, so you see that by only looking at the occupational title, you can end up with very different results, because what we can impute is the same greenness index to that occupation in any country. But again, those people can do things very differently in different countries. So there are also other issues regarding the theoretical aspects of this approach and the methodological aspects, but I leave it there. What we also did, now I would like to also talk about the empirics of this methodology, because then we said, okay, fine, it might not be good to in theoretical terms, but this approach could also be good to in practical terms. It could still give a good approximation of the green employment, the green jobs that are being created in Europe. So what we did was to replicate as close as possible, as we could, this task occupational approach for the EU countries. So we had basically 24 countries, I think, and then total Europe. We did that using two related measures. No need to enter into detail, but what I show here is the most conservative one, but even with the other measure, results are pretty much in line, so they don't change at all the main conclusions. With these estimations, which are the most conservative, as we were saying, we find that the share of green jobs across countries, European countries, ranges between 3 and 5% of the total. Now, most importantly, this share does not vary between 2011, which is when we started, to 2022. Now, the question is, how is it possible that in a period in which the green transition took off and there were significant changes in the productive structures, we don't see this reflected in the amount of green employment in Europe? Our answer to this question was, that's because we are looking at something different. That's because this methodology is not helpful to capture green employment in Europe because of the reasons that I mentioned before. We did also something else, and we simply correlated the presence of green jobs in Europe, in each of the country, with different green and environmental indicators, which are those that I list there. So obviously the hypothesis will be the more green jobs you have in a certain country, the better that country goes in terms of performance, green and environmental indicators, okay? We tried different specification, lagged variables, differences, etc., in order to give more robustness as we could. But basically, we didn't find any positive relationship. Actually, in some countries, in some cases, we also found negative relationship, meaning that the higher the share of green employment in certain countries, basically no relationship with green and environmental indicators. Again, how is that possible? How do we reach these such counterintuitive conclusions? Well, again, because we believe that we are not estimating well green employment, basically, because of the reasons that we mentioned before. Okay, so this basically is the critique, what we did in terms of critique to this approach. Of course, we must do something about it. We cannot just say that. And out there, I would like to, I don't want to go through all the methodology also because it would be very boring probably, but I would like to mention few way outs that have been proposed. Even though that approach that I just criticized is still central there. It's not that our critique basically deleted it. It's still there. So one possible alternative is the one of using online job ads, which not only for green purposes, but also in general in labor markets, is now something very fashionable, which basically researchers have access to the populations of online job ads. And basically using large language models, researchers are able to track what they are interested in. In this case, that could be green tasks, green skills that are specifically demanded by companies to perform specific jobs. Now, this is a fantastic methodology for many aspects because basically it gives you very detailed data of virtually the population of online job ads in a specific country. It also allows you to track the evolution in time of these requirements, and also basically gives you almost real-time information about what a specific firm, a specific sector, a very tiny industry might require in terms, in any terms, but in this case, it can be applied to green employment and green tasks. Of course, this also suffers from limitations. For example, not all jobs can be found in online repository, especially those less skilled, which I believe are also critical for the green transitions, are not there. Usually you find middle to middle high positions there. More importantly, not all jobs that are critical to the green transition have inherently green skills and tasks. For example, again, an accountant would do exactly the same job if he or she works in a solar panel factory or in an oil company. That's basically not going to change. The tasks, the skills that are required by the market are basically the same, but we cannot leave them out. And also this limitation has a potential problem of greenwashing because basically online job ads are made by firms. Firms can write whatever they want in their online job ads, and most likely they write the most beautiful parts of jobs. I've never read an online job ad saying this job is terrible, you have no autonomy, you are going to work on weekend and so on and so forth. I mean, usually online job ads are very skewed, but still, there is a lot of potential there, of course. Now, to me, and this again is only my opinion, the best approach should be able to map all workers that contribute to the production of a green output, okay? that is, those activities, goods and services that contribute to achieve the green transition, and do the other way around compared to what the task or occupational approach does. That is, instead of starting from the occupation and then tries the production, do the other way around. Start from the production, isolate that, and trace back all the employment that contributes to that production. However, of course, this is also it could be very problematic, because usually there are a lot of limitations that simultaneously map with a high degree of detail the production side with the employment input required to that. You can use administrative data, for example, but of course, in many countries, the access to administrative data can be very problematic. Probably, administrative data where you match you have basically the population of workers in a given country with the population of firms. Okay, so that would be the best. However, you don't always have access to that. And therefore, that can be more difficult to disaggregate sectors. Typically, you have, for example, the automotive sectors, which is the automotive sector as such. You don't really know if you are producing e-vehicles or conventional vehicles, okay? Therefore, how you split that can be problematic, and how you trace the specific employment that contributes to each one of them. Anyways, I leave it there probably for discussion, but ideally, I would say that this is kind of where we should go in terms of, at least my favorite. There are also examples here made by private companies, for example, that go in this direction, and I think it's not bad. Now, what time is it? Okay, I'm close to concluding my talk. I have this final slide as terms of policy recommendation, and kind of to synthesize my main points. Okay, so again, the task occupational approach, but to some extent also more advanced method as online job ads, basically what they want to do is to trace the inherently green tasks or skills. That is like, again, designing solar panels, or researching on technologies that reduce energy consumption. Okay, those are clearly green tasks, and for those you clearly need green skills. However, what this approach neglects is that many jobs and their associated tasks and skills, which are key to the green transition, are kind of normal, so to speak, jobs with no specific green characteristics. For example, again, the construction workers. Construction workers did pretty much similar tasks and skill before and after the directive of the Commission. Again, the example of accountants that I have already done, and so on and so forth. If you want to use economic jargon, economists say that to produce something, you have a production function in which enter all the inputs, right, that are needed to produce something. This can be type of capital, land, but also different types of workers. If you don't have accountants, if you don't have drivers in a company, you don't produce the final output, even if you have all the rest. Okay, so this is something that we cannot forget, I think, when we estimate green employment. And this, of course, has important implications for policy. Because if we take the approach that I just mentioned, if we just went to Brussels and say, look, these are the numbers, use them for policy, what should they say? That the green transitions doesn't create green jobs, or that the presence of green jobs does not have any positive impact on green and environmental indicators. So this is to say that our final message to Brussels was kind of watch out with the methodology you use, because it's not neutral, and also the policy implications that can be derived from it are radically different if you go in one direction with one methodology or the other. Now, I realize that I kind of exaggerated my argument. Do I mean that we should not worry about labor markets demand and supply? No, absolutely not. This is not my point. We all know that there are specific skills and jobs that are critical for the green transitions and are not found, and we need to invest in policies to go in that direction. However, the scenario, probably, my take is that it's not that problematic as it is often thought. Also, the transition to one sector to the other is sometimes, from one profession to the other, specifically designed for the green transition, sometimes is easier than we thought. At least this is my impression. And of course, we should not, my topic was about green jobs and green employment, but of course, we should not lose the focus on other issues other obstacles that might be even more important to achieve a full green transition. You've already mentioned the political will to do so. This is primary, but also we have other aspects such as energy prices. We know that industries, for example, solar industries, require cheap energy, basically, which when we have, they require cheap energy to produce solar panels, basically. With the current prices of energy, the production of solar panels, at least in Europe, is just not competitive. Probably it wasn't competitive that much even a while ago, but now it's even more problematic. Of course, the access to critical raw materials, the European Union is moving in that direction. And of course, adequate industrial policies that foster and give support to the green transition in a systematic manner, no matter what happens in the short run, as we are witnessing now, in which, we have politics that seem like to suggest every other day that probably we should go back with the green transitions and so on and so forth. So thank you very much. I hope I was clear, and I'm happy to hear from you.